What would be helpful perhaps is for you to, again, briefly, if you will, Perry, just sketch out what the prevailing narrative has been around this in science. I know that sort of at a popular level, at least, that Richard Dawkins explanation has been widely accepted, touted, disseminated. Could you describe it and then just, again, explain just what you've been seeing in recent years that has been overturning that predominant neo-Darwinian narrative?
Well, I heard Richard Dawkins on an NPR station once a very long time ago, and a caller called in and asked, "Mr. Dawkins, where did life come from?" And he very glibly replied, "It was a happy chemical accident." And then they just went on to the next person as though that was the answer and it was settled. And I was aghast that any self-respecting scientist would say such an anti-scientific answer. And then I go read his books, and it says that we are lumbering robots carrying our genes, and that we exist for the purpose of our genes replicating. And this is a very popular narrative in the popular culture, but very few scientists who are doing highly productive work in the present actually believe that. And so I'll just give you one example. Michael Levin took lung cells out of a cadaver who had just died, so the cells are still alive, put them in a petri dish so that they had nutrients, and they spent about 3 days reforming themselves into you could only describe as a different organism. They turned inside out, and the cilia that used to push mucus up out of the lung turned into propellers, and they started swimming around. And when they put a plate coated with nerve tissue, they put scratched nerves, they put damaged nerves in the petri dish. The former lung cells went and attached themselves to those nerve cells and started repairing the nerve damage. Now, they have the same genomes as lung cells or as a human, but they are functioning as an autonomous organism that is no longer a lung and operating cooperatively. It's likely that they are picking up signals from the nerve cells. We don't know this for sure. It's a good guess they are picking up signals, maybe even SOS signals, and helping them along. And experiments like this show that the genome is just a servant of what the larger organism is doing, and that biology is first and foremost cooperative and not competitive. There's an entire narrative that the world runs on natural selection and survival of the fittest, and it's so pervasive that it is completely overwhelmed the way even scientists work with each other and treat each other. Science is a very cutthroat profession, and I think it's partly because of this narrative that we've had that very poorly reflects the way organisms really work. If you watch Michael Levin's TED Talk, which is 20 minutes long, I don't know how you could finish watching that and still hold the belief that organisms are fundamentally purposeless and that they're just shaped by natural selection. And so I discovered an entire thread of literature going back 70 or 80 years showing a completely different set of conclusions than what was in the popular narrative. Barbara McClintock won the Nobel Prize. Len Margulis was an incredibly respected researcher who brought symbiogenesis, which is the science of cooperation, into popular view. And so what I found when I went deep was completely different than the typical book that you got at the bookstore at Barnes and Noble.
Fascinating. I mean, this is all part of a larger movement that's sometimes been called the third way in biology. Dennis, why has this movement faced such opposition from other scientists in the academy?
Well, I think you have to ask the question, where is the money? It's very simple. Take the National Institute of Mental Health. It's spent $8 billion over the last 20 years on the theory that they would be able to find the genes for schizophrenia, the genes for depression. All of these are phenomena that run in families. So to give them credit, there was, as it were, a basis for thinking that it might be these are genetic diseases, and therefore we might be able to cure them through discovering which were the genes, go in and repair them, and Bob's your uncle, you've cured the disease. Nothing like that has happened after 30 years of genome sequencing. What we now know is there's no gene for schizophrenia. The sad fact is that we will never predict who is going to suffer that disease from the genetics. So I think part of the problem is that we've got like a big battleship cruising along nicely with its energy being supplied. The energy is the money, of course. It's going to take an almighty effort to turn that around now and say, no, wait a minute, purposive biological investigation is actually much more predictive than the genome. I've shown that. An article that appeared just last year in one of the oldest biological journals in the world, the Journal of the Linnaean Society, named after Linnaeus, the great classifier of species. And what we showed in that article was one example after another where attributing purposiveness to the organism enables you to predict, even at the molecular level, what is happening. Now, that gets technical. I don't think you want a technical account in this particular broadcast. But example after example showed that it was much more predictive of what you need to look for at the lower level of the molecular biology of the organisms concerned than anything to do with genes could be. It really is the case, therefore, one example after another, we've got the whole process backwards. We need now to turn that battleship round. It'll take an enormous amount of effort because there are whole armies of people dedicated to the gene-centric view and doing science on that basis. They can't suddenly all become physiologists and look at function or look at purpose in biology. It's as bad as that. It's as though an army has been sent into a war that's fought for the wrong reason. And you then work out what you're going to do. You've got 1 million people employed with the feeding of them and all the provisions that need to be provided for. And you've got to retrain them as what? Tailors to go back into being, as it were, in civil society. I mean, actually, it's not a bad analogy because after wars, that's what you actually have to do. My father was a tailor. He was a soldier in the First World War too. And so it's a bit like that. We're going to have to find a way of turning this battleship round, and it's going to take an enormous amount of effort to do so. And there is very strong resistance. But I'll tell you another thing. The people who are still broadcasting the idea that genes are going to be the explanation for why we are the living, purposeful organisms we are, they have gone very silent over the last few years. I do not think they have an answer. I debated all of this with Richard Dawkins in a broadcast which has gone viral in various parts of the world. And he had no answers to all the examples I gave. Again, I don't want to go into the technology, but one example after another that I gave to him, he divert it off to use his usual mantra about genes are causes of what we are, rather than address the detailed examples I gave. Everybody can look that up. Everybody can find all the literature that I cited too. It's all there on the website.
Yes, and it's fair to say that possibly Richard Dawkins' most significant work was published in the 1970s, and really actually not much, from what I'm hearing from you, Dennis, he hasn't really kept abreast of the way in which this has completely changed in the last few decades.